Panel's all here. My name's Joe McDonald. I'm the moderator. We met ahead of time, and we made some ground rules. So I'm going to share those ground rules, and then we'll launch into it. The first thing is we want to ground our conversation in the book and in Elizabeth's comments on the book. We want to have a text-based conversation. And we want to ask you, when you write down your questions, that you do the same thing, so that we'll all be making references back to the text. Second thing that we agreed to is that I would ask each panelist a question to kind of get them to make their contribution, and that I would certainly target their expertise and their interests, and to the extent that I know them, but I wouldn't tell them exactly what the question was ahead of time. So we'd get a little bit of spontaneity in the conversation. So they don't know quite what I'm going to ask, but they know it's going to be something they can answer. The third thing that we decided was to give every panelist just 5 minutes, which will be painful for me if I have to cut them off, because I could listen to any one of them for longer than 20 minutes. Probably not much longer than 20 minutes, but if we each take longer than 5 minutes, then we'll take all your time away for our larger text-based question. So those are our ground rules. And one final point, we agreed that I'd start with a kind of observation on the book that would build on what Elizabeth's already said. And I'm going to do that now, and then I'm going to start on the questions. My observation is that what makes this book so interesting and so valuable is that Elizabeth manages to capture, and in a way that breaks through some dichotomies, a kind of turn in how we think about teaching. It's a kind of teaching, she describes, that nobody's really figured out completely yet, articulated thoroughly, but there are some pioneers out there who are trying, who have tried and continue to try, and she's interviewed most of them. And that's the kind of magic of the book. It's a kind of teaching that's really hard to do, and I think she's told us some of the ways in which it is. And yet, you can see it done in many New York City classrooms today. And when you do, at least for me, it kind of startles me. It takes my breath away sometimes. And the reason is because you glimpse below the surface of the behaviors some of this infrastructure going on, some of its data, some of its knowledge of kids, some of its team planning behind the scenes. But it's infrastructure, and it looks different than teaching used to look. I'm going to start now the questions. And the first one, because we're talking about teaching, and we've all been teachers, except in a sense for Elizabeth and her final chapter of the book. And you're all going to buy the book if you haven't already, and you're going to read that chapter in which she dares to explore teaching firsthand as a teacher at School of the Future, no less. In any case, I'm going to ask Rousseau, who's a daily teacher in a 6th grade classroom, to take on this idea of a kind of turn, of a very complicated thing that people are getting increasingly used to, and tell us a little bit about what your experience of those complications is. But first, you have a chance to talk about how you're portrayed in the book, because I counted about 15 references in the book to Rousseau, and first as a student himself, and then as a teacher. And you have a right now to talk about anything you want to challenge in terms of how you're portrayed in the book, before you go on to answer my question.
Well, I guess I kind of want to address the question because I think they're sort of one and the same. I I feel really, really blessed to sort of have Elizabeth force me to think about my experiences at No Excuses Charter School and sort of like how that relates to my experiences now as a teacher. And I think it's really helped my practice, because I think what I've been able to sort of distill is that it all comes down to your vision. I think any teacher who steps into a classroom, whether they want to accept it or not, day one, they are a leader. And like any sort of leadership position, it requires vision. And really what vision is to me is this idea of combining courage and lots of humility. And I think that, as a student, thinking back on some of my, teachers that sort of scarred me, I think a lot of them didn't have the humility to sort of approach the day-to-day to sort of, build a relationship or expose their own sort of flaws for the sort of greater good of hooking myself or other scholars in. Then I think about my own struggles as a teacher. Specifically, I think when I think about sort of like pushing students to the highest level of achievement, their shortcomings sort of are outcroppings of my own insecurities. And I think that those conversations, along with sort of the last few years of teaching, have really shown me that it comes down to your willingness to step into a classroom, be humble, fail, and build and grow, and get up and fail some more and build and grow. And just sort of the continual process. Obviously, I'm sure there are teachers who do that by themselves. It's great to have a team of people who are helping with that. I think the team, my favorite sort of like teamwork makes the dream work. I think that sort of applies to my favorite experiences teaching, where I had people who supported me when I did things that were really great for students, could recognize those strengths, but also could recognize where I needed to grow.
Thanks. Megan, how do you build a school around infrastructure? What does it mean? You're a principal. What does it mean to try to do that, pull that off at the school level?
So I almost wish I could pull up your graphic of all the different circles around it, because when I saw that, I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. But I would actually add one more circle to that, and it's that I opened a new school, and I was coming in, and I had all these ideas. This is what teaching is. This is what learning is. This is what we're going to do. And I almost kind of like forgot my beginning teacher idea that I actually have to build trust first. That I have to establish myself, saying that I'm not just asking you to do this, that I'm actually going to go and I'm going to sit in the chair and I'm going to teach all 60 first graders, because we don't quite know what shared writing is like. And if you don't start building that trust, it really doesn't matter what your scheduling looks like, how well you use your budget, what kind of people you have in the building. If you don't find a way to have your staff and your teachers trust that it's okay to fail in some ways, like you were saying, that we're going to try these things out, but that I'm also there for your best interest, that I want you to be successful, and I want you to be successful for kids and for you. And part of that building with teachers too, and I think that a lot of the history of education here is that it's kind of been okay to just be okay. And that a lot of teachers get really comfortable with like, well, I just come and like, I feel good about this, and getting them to the place of like, you might feel good about this, but you can actually feel great about this. And your kids can feel great about this. And to really start pulling out of teachers this like idea that I want to be so much better for this. I want to be better for my kids, and I want to be better for me. Because once you have your staff really understanding that, that's when you can really see how do you like use your budget. And I think some of like the infrastructure pieces is that principals don't always know how to use their budget. The kind of ways that where I say that if I want a coach, or if I want an ICT team, or if I want intervention in this way, that those actually say a lot about what I value as a school leader and for my school. But getting people on board then allows you, if you can think about what does scheduling look like? What does it mean to have like second grade teachers all in prep at the same time? Or if you have a bridge class and a self-contained and you want them to talk to both third and fourth, how do you do that? And I think that kind of infrastructure gets lost sometimes when it just becomes, so I hope every kid gets gym every day, when it's really more complicated than that, and you need to be able to see this kind of like top-down version of what is my vision for my school. What is the way that I want teachers to interact with kids, with each other, and with me?
That's great. So, Phil, we have to shift the metaphor a little bit because everybody knows you've got infrastructure. Phil is the Deputy Chancellor for Teaching and Learning in New York City. 1.2 million kids, more than 1,800 schools last count. How do you, from where you sit in that gigantic operation, view this issue of helping a Rousseau and a Megan do the complicated work of teaching well, a kind of teaching that takes seriously individual learners?
About creating a system of collaborative educators, people who work together, who don't compete with each other, but who are working toward a common goal, which is this goal of making the schools the best place possible. I've been, up until January, I had spent 29 and a half years in schools, and every single success that I ever had somebody else's fingerprints all over them. Whether it was the assistant principal who was working with me as a teacher, or if it was the principal who hired me and encouraged me to continue to work and grow, there was colleagues who helped me become a better classroom teacher, or the successes I had as a school leader were directly and only about other people's work in the end. We have to embrace the fact that the only thing we can do is collaborate with each other to get better. And we're starting to do that in the New York City Department of Education in ways that are really fascinating and powerful. We have programs like our Showcase Schools program, which is designed to allow schools that are doing something well to show it off to other people so other people can learn. Or a Learning Partners program, which is a systemic approach to having schools work together over really a year-long course of study, where one school identifies something that they think that's working well for them, two other schools join them, try to be in a year-long conversation about how to do it better, how to do it well, how to implement it in their schools if it's not happening. Those are system-wide ways in which we're doing that, but really probably the key thing that's happening right now is this movement toward 80 minutes of professional development every week that is designed to be a conversation in schools, amongst people who work in school, to talk about how to get better. We rolled out a set of citywide instructional expectations last year that first and foremost ask schools to get to know their students well, and then to develop an instructional focus based upon their knowledge of their students. This really is ratified by the book, absolutely. And then the goal of those 80 minutes is to take that time, take a look at what you know of your students, take a look at what your instructional focus is, and work together to experiment, to grow, to try to develop the best practices possible within your own community to make sure that you can meet your students' needs.
Val, as a teacher educator, how do you feel about this book is the core question. But and what do you think teacher education can do to kind of advance this vision of a more complicated teaching that is more obviously complicated to lots more people than is the case today?
I think you provide in the stories that you tell of this more complicated teaching a model or a parallel for what happens in a graduate school that is leaning towards developing that. So I'm going to look at the book.
That's great. That's great. That's great.
And there's a section in the book where you talk about, I believe that she's a high school literacy teacher. You love to write about math. I love to read your writing about math, but here's a place where you're writing about a literacy teacher.
Just the token person. I don't actually care.
Oh, I'm sorry. You know what? I'm sorry, and I'm just lied because it's a math section that I've had. But anyway, but I remember that literacy part too. So you're talking about what Magdalene Lampert is a goal that she has for a student. She said he needed to think about math, not just as an assignment forced on him by a teacher, but as a challenge that he could be curious about, as a puzzle that made sense. And you need to figure out how to disagree about whether a mathematical idea, how to disagree respectfully, whether about a mathematical idea or something more personal. And I think in that story, and in so many of the stories you told to me, what resonated was, oh, that's my work. That's the work that I do with teacher educators. I hope that what I do and that what good teacher preparation programs do is to help teachers see their work as a puzzle that they need to feel curious about, that they feel that they have a voice in the, there are so many programs and curricula and, the flavor of the month that get thrown at teachers, that teachers can develop the capacity in their early training to have a voice, to advocate for what they think is right for their kids within their context. And so I saw so many of those parallels. I think in order to help teachers do it, we have to do it with teachers. And that's, I think, also a parallel that I heard in what each of you was talking about in your context. So each of you talked about the power of conversation and collaboration and working with others to sort of help realize a bigger vision. That through speaking about your experiences, Rousseau, you gained some insight into thinking about yourself as a practitioner, that the power of building relationships within your school building as a way to sort of create change, the power of building collaborative relationships structurally, within schools and then across schools and across the district and across districts as a way to build change. And I think that's it. That's where we have the leverage to make some really powerful change.
What a model panel. Nobody went over time. So, Elizabeth, that gives us lots of time now but let's give you the first word, Elizabeth, in sort of response to anything that you heard here.
So the parallel between teaching students and teaching teachers, I think, is very powerful. The two arguments that I argue in my book that are the main arguments we have for improving education in this country are autonomy on the one hand and accountability on the other hand. So either let the teachers be free to figure this out on their own. It's such individual work that they need to make all the decisions themselves, or hold the teachers accountable for their results until they're forced to do better. And clearly, neither one of those is going to be sufficient to get us to where we need to go, because both fundamentally leave teachers on their own to figure out this complicated work. But the place where that duality is best addressed is in classrooms every single day, when teachers have to decide either to leave their kids on their own to figure a problem out or hold them very tightly accountable for the result. And nobody solves that problem better than great teachers with kids. No one would ever think with kids, let's just leave them in a room and hope that they invent Shakespeare. And at the same time, no one would ever think, let's just give them a Shakespeare test every day until they pass. These would be foolish ideas, and yet this is how we think about teachers in our education system. So I completely agree with you about the parallel. Teachers are just another kind of learner, and we should learn systemically from great teachers.
So you've been studying teaching all your life and writing about it since you were 17, but yet when you went to School of the Future and a teacher friend of yours, this is her final chapter for those of you who haven't read the book yet. What happened? What happened in that experience? Share a little bit of that.
So Andy Snyder, who's a New York City public school teacher, a Department of Education teacher, who I spent a lot of time in his classroom, said you would you're a fraud if you write this book and never try teaching yourself. And I said, is every TMZ reporter also a fraud for not marrying Kim Kardashian every day? Are the political reporters frauds because they don't run for office before writing about tomorrow's election? No, but I still let him force me to try teaching. So I did, and what happened was that I experientially relearned a lot of the things that people had told me. First, I learned that for one thing, my personality, as Rousseau was saying, played a role, but not a defining role. I actually needed some skills that I didn't have. So I tried to facilitate a discussion and utterly failed. I just could not track what each student was even saying. I was so focused on trying to do all the things at once that I knew were important, that I had seen experts do, that I couldn't even do the fundamental basic thing of hearing what anyone was saying to me. So in that way, I just fell on my face. In other ways, I think I was so much better off for having talked to all of the people that I talked to for this book, because I didn't think about teaching as a lecture. I thought of it as an engagement with learners.
Now, we have a plan here, I think, for getting some questions from you all. And, you know, lots will go to Elizabeth, but if you have a question for any panelist, feel free to address it that way, too. And I saw her recently give a talk in which she handled 4 questions at once and just kind of read them off and acknowledged who'd asked them and then started a launch on the answer. So we're going to try that here. But while you are, and I see people are passing out some cards there, or you're passing them in, while that's going on, let's see if anybody else on the panel here has something that they want to recall from the book or bring up from the book.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I have a question for everyone. So for Phil, you were saying that the idea is to get each school to facilitate collaboration and then also for schools to collaborate. But one thing I wonder about is, what is the right unit of change? Is it the individual school or is it bigger? And how do each of you think about that?
I would imagine that it's probably all of the above as an answer. What we are instituting now is ways in which we can work with individual teachers to change. The much more disaggregated teacher development and evaluation system is designed to, on the most granular level in terms of what we have happening in schools, the level of the teacher, find ways that we can help teachers target specific practices that can help them improve individually. The next level is engaging the whole of that community, that school community, in discussion about what to do for themselves individually, but also for their students as a whole. And a conversation that is a collaboration about what and that's a we are going to do for our students. And then the city needs to be in conversation with itself about how schools will improve and how we need to take responsibility for each other. That it is not a competition amongst schools to get better, but it is a moral imperative for all schools to help every other school to make sure that we educate the 1.1 or 1.2 million young people who show up at our doorsteps every day.
Can I piggyback on that, which is to say, I think the other unit of change there is the teacher preparation and how the teacher preparation connects with the lives of teachers and schools, in the system. And I think too often they have operated in separate spheres and worlds. We prepare the teachers, they go off and they teach, our work is done, now it's PD, and our work in the graduate school is over. And I think there are really interesting ways to think about leveraging the connections between what happens in teacher preparation and what happens in the field. There are many points of intersection. Student teaching, where we have, student teachers in classrooms, where we have people learning to be leaders, working with leaders in schools. We have, adjuncts who come from the field to teach courses. We have faculty doing research in schools and classrooms. There are many, many opportunities to strengthen and connect the work that happens sort of across the, if we think of teaching developmentally as we think of kids developmentally. So we go from, the beginning before you've done it at all to, 20 years in the field. How do we think developmentally about teachers and how do we then sort of connect the stages of their development in more thoughtful and coherent ways?
I would kind of echo the idea of it really focusing on schools and schools having to collaborate with each other. That for too long it's really been about this inner competitiveness and this idea that I'm trying to one-up you, or that I at my school had this great idea, but I'm not going to share with you because it's really like for my school and my kids. And my staff knows I'm very competitive and I really like to be the best. And we talk though about us being the best doesn't mean that someone else is not the best. That we're in a school with I have a building with 4 schools, and these are all kids, and our kids getting what they need as learners, as individuals, should not be at the expense of someone else. And it's a really hard conversation to have in general when things are so competitive for money, for resources, for time, but that it's really the job of the leader, of the principal, to have those conversations. And it's like, you know what, yes, I will take the not great lunchtime because I need this at this time, but you get the gym, and in those smaller ways too, so that everyone does feel successful.
Well, so I don't think I've ever worked at a school where I didn't feel on some level a sense of hostility that didn't have to do, that sort of I don't want to say that people are fighting each other and arguing and there's anger, but there's this sense of sort of my classroom, and not just my classroom because I'm the teacher, I am the champion teacher, but more this is really personal work, and it's really sort of not to say it's as personal as that quote that you shared earlier, but some of the best teachers that I've seen teach are some of the most sort of hostile teachers that I've worked with because they care so much about the classroom that they're willing to defend it by any means. And I don't know if, I've heard some of those, one of the most interesting quotes, someone actually shared this with me just recently. They said, we're working hard to be a team and a family, but teaching is an individual sport disguised as a team sport. And I think therein lies the fundamental issue, right? It's not that, because I don't disagree with that, but I think that that's the problem, that we need to stop agreeing with that sort of idea, and I think we'll start to see some change there.
You learned a lot from Rousseau, didn't you?
Yes, and now you get to.
Could you say a few things about what you learned from him?
Well, I just learned something right now that I had never thought of before. One thing that I learned, so I met Rousseau through his former teacher and mentor, Doug Lemov, and applaud if you're familiar with Doug Lemov's work. So some people aren't. Oh, a lot of people are. So Doug Lemov is both famous and, frankly, somewhat infamous. And one of the reasons that he and his work are somewhat infamous is that he's a representative of what I call the No Excuses Charter School movement. And so his schools take a certain approach to teaching, and in particular, discipline that some have criticized. And I was trying to really wrestle with what I made of that, and talked a lot with Doug about that. And when I asked him a lot of questions, he kept saying, well, I think you should talk to students too. And in particular, you should talk to this student of mine, Rousseau, who is now becoming a teacher. And he is one of the most thoughtful people that I know on this topic and others. And that was the beginning of a long conversation between me and Rousseau about that subject, and I learned a tremendous amount from Rousseau about that subject, but interestingly and not coincidentally also about academic teaching as well.
Great. So I've got a bunch of questions I've been rifling through, and I'm going to give you some too to rifle through, but the first 4 questions here are all about infrastructure, so I'm going to give you those at once, and then I've got a couple questions for Phil too that come from the cards. Okay, so the first one is, how do you stabilize infrastructure and expectations in a gigantic system like the DOE that's at the mercy of political leadership, mayoral control, often changing every 4 years? So that's question number 1, stability. Here's another one. Can we use and apply the infrastructure idea among the youngest kids in early childhood, particularly at a moment when we're building this whole system of new early childhood institutions in the city? Here's another one. Rousseau talks powerfully about the familiar and necessary fail, get up process. Yet failing in the classroom carries both professional risk and consequences for students. What in infrastructure can be built to facilitate productive failure? So that's a question for you, and maybe Rousseau can answer that. And finally, here's one from Thandi at the New Teacher Center. Which examples of infrastructure have you seen have the greatest impact on accelerating teacher learning and practice? Is that too much? You want to pass those down to Elizabeth quickly so she
Can
can.
we start with Phil and the DOE question? Because I'm dying to hear
Sure.
the answer to that.
I thought you were answering that for me, and I have a note card here, so I'm ready to write it down.
Journalistic impact in action. Shoot. I think that, so the early childhood question is fascinating to me because we're at a really unique historic moment in time when there is an incredible opportunity to build this because we have very little structure. And I think that the challenge that I see is what is going to be the way that happens? What is the theory of change? Who is responsible for creating structured opportunities for early childhood educators to learn? And one of the opportunities at the federal level is with the early learning goals. Like what do we define as the goals of early learning? And I think that's where those exist, but there are no mechanisms to translate those, or very few mechanisms, I think, to translate those standards which are written into federal law into something meaningful on the ground. So thinking about that mechanism, I think, is one way to think about that. I think that the idea of productive failure is exactly what infrastructure is made to create. So infrastructure is not in any way my term. It's David Cohen's term, the education historian who has taught a lot of people at this panel, including me. And by the way, the chart that I use was created by one of his graduate students, Seneca Rosenberg. So I think one of the theories that I learned from people who study this concept is about highly reliable organizations. This is sort of another way to describe organizations that have a strong infrastructure. They're highly reliable. So that means that it's unlikely that they are going to fail. And if you think about that as the outcome, then the challenge is how do you make it so that the reality that everyone is learning on the job is mitigated so that Rousseau's starting from a higher place than he otherwise would start. So everyone's going to learn, but they're not going to necessarily fail in a way that hurts kids. One example of what that looks like, that is one of the examples of a strong infrastructure that I've seen to accelerate teacher learning, is the Boston Teacher Residency in the last 2 years has been doing a reset of its model in response to evidence that its teachers were not effectively prepared to help students learn at highly reliable levels. And part of their reset is identifying the routines that they can prepare teachers to use that apply at different levels of teaching and that can be taught. So these routines are very connected to learning goals, to the Common Core standards and the Massachusetts standards in the case of the Boston Teacher Residency. But they add on not just a description of what students should do, but what teachers can do in a reliable fashion that will regularly get students to do that. So within the structure of these routines that are instructional activities that are likely to lead children to learn, teachers will make mistakes, and I saw it happen, but an example of the kind of mistake that a teacher would make is to generate learning and thought, but not as efficiently as a master teacher could. So the definition of failure in that context is a lack of efficiency, a lack of precision, but not a lack of learning. Because the activity in its most basic form generates learning. And then as for what the Department of Education can do, I think what I'm curious about is the evolution of the theory of change within the Department of Education from one that was recently focused on individual school leaders and giving them a space to create strong learning opportunities. And then I'm curious, what should be common across every school besides just accountability? What are the things that can be common? And some of the things that have been tried in the past are, teachers in learning communities working around data, as Shail Saransky was a proponent of. I think I'm accurate. He looks so straight-faced that I'm afraid I got this wrong. But what else can be common across schools besides experiences for teachers that are structural but maybe not content specific, or besides accountability? I think the lack of those commonalities is one of the things that holds us back from maybe moving faster.
So let's get Phil to comment on that, but first I'm going to give him 2 other questions. So you got 3 to wrestle with. Your other 2 are, how can we create effective developmental pathways for teachers? And the second one, this is from Mark Barak, who's from the Teach for America Advisory Board. Do you feel that the best practices are shared between district schools and charter schools? Have you seen that happen successfully, that sharing across the sectors?
So as to the developmental pathways that we're looking for in our classrooms, we are beginning that by creating this common language around what good teaching and learning looks like. We've been lucky to embrace the Danielson rubric and the way in which we have codified that or moved that to a simpler frame with just 8 components this year. I think will allow for that conversation to happen even more deeply. The movement toward a common language is a movement toward allowing us to be able to work across schools, but within schools in ways that are really efficient, I think, in terms of helping people change practice. And then the system of evaluation that we're creating allows us to target the specific needs of each individual teacher so that we can help them move in ways that are most useful for their students. Probably the thing that we need to promote most is building in ways in which this collaborative culture that we want to create is valued beyond a sort of a moral imperative that we all feel as part of our heart. I think everybody in this room probably feels it anyway. But we must need to name it more often and make it something that's an important part of our school system. That's beginning to happen as we look at the capacity framework that the DOE is going to work on. It speaks specifically about collaborative teachers, but more than that, it speaks about the entirety of the system being built around trust. And without that kind of trust, without people being able to work with each other in ways that they can find trustworthy and where they can admit that they, rather than fail, that they weren't as successful as they would have wanted to have been in a lesson, that they could have done this differently and they'd like some ideas about how to do it differently, that's where the best work will happen. When I was principal at Telecommunications, the movement toward putting people in a room together to talk about their work with a grade level of students was initially met with a great deal of trepidation, partly for all the reasons we're talking about right now, because it meant people opening up and saying, I know that Joey turned in his homework to you, he hasn't turned in any homework to me, what can I do differently? That implies a kind of failure on the speaker's part, but it isn't. It's a request for making sure you serve all of your students more thoughtfully. And as the work in teams took hold in the school over time, we served our students much more efficiently, much more strongly. I think our students learned much better in ways that we're really proud of. And I've totally forgotten what the second question was.
Doesn't matter. We'll move on in the text-based conversation. Elizabeth, another question here about the charter district, and this one, and you, if you haven't read the book yet, she does some remarkable crosswalking between these sectors, I think, in terms of her interviews. And this one is about the emphasis in the book on coherence, another kind of word for infrastructure, you might say. And this person who is A.J. Rathman Noonan from the NYC DOE suggests that you cite it more often in the charter world, and this person's wondering, have you seen it elsewhere besides in the charter world?
Not really, is the honest answer. New Visions for Public Schools is one exception that I trot out every time someone accuses me of being anti-union. I have to admit that. As a journalist, I'll just say that frankly. But it's also true, which is a network of district Department of Education schools that I think operates not unlike a charter management organization. And so so first, like the idea of coherence, infrastructure is nothing without coherence. So if you have a teacher preparation program that's telling a teacher how to teach really well to one set of learning goals, and then you have the teacher walk into a school that cares about different learning goals, and then you have the teacher go to a professional development on the weekend that has a third set of concerns, this is the current system that we have in most of the country. And that is a real problem. And the advantage, this is not because of a lack of leadership, I think, within districts. I think in the last 15 years, we've had a set of leaders who are the best set up people we could have imagined to build infrastructure. What they were working inside of was a governance problem, which is one major restriction on coherence, which is that we have not had, we have a resistance to commonness that Rousseau has identified the emotional root of just now, but this resistance is also built into our democratic governance structure, that we have a federal system of education, a state government, and then district governments, and then within that we have individuals, and then because of that lack of coherence, the private sector is also very incoherent. So whereas in Japan, the textbook publishers are working to serve a market that has a single course of study that they have agreed on and that teachers iterate over every 10-year period, so the textbooks are very well suited to serving the teachers and the learning goals. In this country, the textbook markets and the assessment makers need to serve the lowest common denominator of a very messed up governance structure. And so as a result, it's very difficult to get to force professional learning to happen within our existing governance structure. Now, does that mean we should give up on American democracy? Like, I think there's a lot of reasons not to do that also. So just the fact that it hasn't, that I don't think that there's evidence that it's existed yet. And when I say that, it's because many observers and researchers, including David Cohen, don't think that they've ever seen a case of strong educational infrastructure emerge within the traditional governance structure of American education. Does that mean we should give up? I don't think so, because I think we have some indicators that we're willing to move in a different direction over time. I think a really interesting question is, in what way will that happen? One way would be kind of sort of more top-down, like clearly we have leadership in the New York City Department of Education right now, in Denver public schools where I just was, in many different parts of this country that wants to create this, but so they could say, you know, I'm creating this, the Common Core is my instigator and my partner, and this provides me with the measure of commonness that I need to go forward. And this would also help the outside institutions like teacher education and assessment makers and curriculum makers and textbook makers also sort of get into an alignment so that everyone is working together rather than unintentionally at cross purposes without knowing what direction they want to go in. A second way it could happen is bottom up. And that's something we're also seeing happen. So I recently learned of a group of teachers who formed themselves in Reno, Nevada, inspired by the Common Core standards, but frustrated with their district's opportunities to work towards those standards. With the textbook they were provided, the curriculum they were provided, they thought it didn't really align, as, by the way, the Common Core authors also think none of this stuff aligns. So they created a learning group of teachers for themselves to create something different, sought out through the internet and connected with both charters and others to try to find other ways to move forward. And this bottom-up group, grassroots group of educators, has now spread, and different educators are now part of their group from many different states, including parts of New York State. So that's another way it could happen.
So we've got two more questions, actually three questions, but two of them are combined. The first one goes to Megan, addressed to Megan, and it's from Ines Ellis Grandiola from PS 89. And I'm just paraphrasing. You know that teachers have to fail to do good work. They have to fail occasionally to deal with all the complications of teaching. How do you create, as a school leader, an environment that allows that failure and is yet accountable and you know, there's clear evaluation standards in place, et cetera? How do you make that balance happen?
I mean, I think the first piece is to put yourself out there, just like you want your teachers to put yourself out there. Like, there are many days when I will facilitate a PD or a meeting and I'm just like, well, that really stunk. Like, that was like not the best thing that I could do. And then having that conversation, or like stopping in the middle, like your example, like the lesson's not going great, like I need to recap what's going on here, and really being transparent with your teachers about that too, and about the expectations that you hold both yourself to and the expectations that you hold your teachers to and your whole school community. And that it's not just about being, and that doesn't mean that the bar is ever lowered, it means that we're really always pushing and searching and pushing ourselves to do better. Because we do have this moral imperative. We want to do better for our kids. We want to do better for our system, for our school, and for our structures, and we have to keep pushing ourselves to do that. And really then taking those opportunities of that failure to talk about it and be reflective about it. I think one of the hardest things to push teachers to do sometimes and to build in people is that reflective capability of being able to say, you know, this happened in my classroom, and I'm wondering, like, why did this happen? How did I contribute to it? What were the things that I could have done to prevent it? And allowing the space to have that conversation both as someone's supervisor and with people's colleagues. So getting other teachers in there, because they might see something different. They might have other opportunities to give feedback or talk about things. But that collaborative piece of that people are always in your classroom. People always are having chances to talk about kids, to talk about teaching, because that really is the heart of the school, is kids and teaching.
So two final questions, and then we're going to adjourn. There are books for sale. There's some refreshments out front, so we can continue the conversation. These two questions, one of them is a broad one, and the other gets a little more specific. We can start with Elizabeth on these, and then anyone else on the panel. The question is, how does race and understanding how race plays into students' lives and schools figure into making better teachers? That's from Sabine at Bronx Leadership Academy 2. And here's another one. I'd like somebody here, this is from Renee at TFA, to define the students, quote unquote, we are talking about today. Specifically, can you talk about students living in poverty, students of color, students free and reduced lunch? Does excellent teaching look different for those students? If so, how? Elizabeth, you want to take that on?
Sure. So there's as the person who asked the question knows, the second question, there's different views on that question. I was fascinated to talk to people who have different views on that question. One person who believes very strongly that teaching looks the same no matter what population you're serving is Dave Levin of KIPP, which I think is really interesting to think about, because a criticism of KIPP and schools like it is that that's not the way that, you know, that's not the school that the educators would send their kids to, that there's somehow a different approach. I just put that out there as a provocative thought. Where I landed myself is that I think, so in the case of math, what's important is for teachers to really see their students' starting place. And they need to understand what their students understand. This is just, I think, as true for what students understand about math as it is for what students understand about their place in the world, which is shaped by their race, their class, their family experience. And so I do think that it's really important, and I don't think Dave Levin would disagree with this part, that teachers have a very strong understanding of this element of their students' lives as well as what their students are likely to misunderstand about math, or how they make sense of math. And I think the ways in which race, class, poverty shape students' experiences mean teaching in that place and those communities, in these communities, looks different.
And you take this up a bit, the whole segment does. And I know you don't love the whole segment, in some ways, but maybe tell us a little bit about that and that experience and your experience then.
I think that I would be a liar if I said that race wasn't important. I think that I wouldn't be sort of doing the work of pushing the conversation about race. However, I think that one of the reasons why it's such a provocative topic is because we're not actually willing to talk about it, right? It's one of those characteristics or pieces of someone's personality it's a sensitive topic, and really sensitive really for teachers, not necessarily students. Students are ready to talk if we're willing to talk, right? There's race, there's sexuality and gender, and my kids are more than happy to talk to me about that. But the minute they start talking, I look, is the principal watching? What am I allowed to talk about? And I think that sort of at the root of the issue is that we as educators, let me back up. There's one thing I think that should look the same no matter where you walk into, no matter whether you're walking into a classroom across the street or in Brooklyn and Bushwick. I think that the thing that should remain consistent are high expectations, right? Our expectations for what students are capable of. We need to sort of like push our boundaries about what we believe those expectations are. The things that should change are sort of our approach toward getting to know our students in their communities. Again, race is a big piece of that. But I don't think it is the piece of the puzzle that sort of defines all of the work. There needs to be a broader conversation because human beings are so nuanced in and of themselves. And we need to really push getting to know kids. I like to think of teaching as sort of like, there's this information that I teach you. However, we're sort of, a lot of it should just be sort of, my favorite classes in college were the classes where we read a little bit and then we discussed for 55 minutes because I was a part of that discussion. And I think that when our students start to feel like they're a part of whatever discussion it is, whether it's the 30 different ways to solve a math problem or which philosophy was the best for ancient China, right? All of these topics sort of, when students are forced to talk about them and read about them, they sort of, that to me is the key. The key to sort of the question about, is race important? Well, yes. Well, it's really just getting to know an individual, but then 30 of them or 40 of them or 100 of them.
Can I say one more thing that I forgot? We also have to acknowledge the ways in which race has shaped our existing school systems and approaches, and especially clear to me in the reporting process and this issue of discipline that you're asking Rousseau about is the ways in which not understanding other people in a humane, respectful way has led to some really distorted, problematic, destructive pedagogy and systemic problems with the way our discipline system works, especially for children of color and especially for male children of color. And so if we don't talk about that, we're missing another piece of the puzzle too. And so to pretend that race doesn't matter also is to not to acknowledge some of the challenges with where we're starting. But I have to also say, echoing what Rousseau said, it was really hard for me to write about race, and it is really hard to have conversations about race when just the nature of where our conversation is today. So thank you for whoever posed that question. I think we need to push that to be part of the conversation more.
So thanks to Bank Street, thanks to Teach for America for convening this fabulous group of folks. Thank you for your attention. And let's continue the conversation.